Monday with Mitch. Today we're talking about how groups influence us. My name is Mitch Weisberg. Last week we had some guest authors on, and that was really interesting. We got to talk about some really interesting books. But this week we're going to focus on groups. And I thought that before we officially start the broadcast, I'd like you to think about two vastly different examples of how groups shape us. So, first, consider the school that we visited when we were in Portugal, the Alpha Coop School, just outside of Porto. A decade ago, it was losing students and pretty much in danger of closing. But a core group of teachers banded together. They created a shared vision, which they called Education 5.0, and they transformed it into a thriving, internationally recognized institution. And that's an incredibly good use of a group, collaborating to achieve something that none of us could do alone. And then on the flip side, groups can also do a massive disservice to their members. Think about political echo chambers or teenagers who bully others just to fit in with their friends. In those cases, the group kind of forces individuals to self censor, to adopt binary thinking, and compromise their own morals just to avoid being cast out. Groups today can be our biggest asset, or they can be our biggest trap. So keep that in mind today as we dive into groups. So, we're streaming live on both LinkedIn and Substack, and today we're talking about a force that shapes almost everything we do, everything we believe, and everything we fight about, the groups we belong to. We're going to explore how groups influence us and why they make us act in ways we sometimes wouldn't on our own, and also how we can protect our independent thinking. Now, this is tied directly to our newest conversation circle guide called When the Room Changes Your Mind. So, if you want to download that guide and lead your own discussion on groups, the guide is free, and just scan the QR code, and you can download the free guide. Before we dive into the biology of groups, let's start with a quick question for the chat. So, everybody, I'd like you to think of a group you belong to. Maybe your family, your workplace, a church, a school, a team. How has being part of that group changed what you believe or how you act? And maybe you can let me know in the chat. So I can talk about my own experience. As a child, I was part of the family group, right? And my experiences, really, really shaped me. Uh, my mom was always a person who i- she instilled in us the value of family, and I still hold that to get today. She had us visit our grandparents virtually every weekend, and we do that with our kids, and we try to do it, with our grandkids. My father was an entrepreneur, and he was always about independent thinking and arguing, and that kind of shaped me, as a kid. And then as an adult, I can talk about a little bit about how I'm shaped by the groups that I belonged with. So let's just say that I'm with friends who were very liberal, okay, or with other friends who support Trump. Even though I'm aware of how the groups influence us or how they pressure us, those groups still nudge me. When I'm with people who are very liberal and they're talking about all the bad things that are happening, even if I disagree with them, I'm really unlikely to say something. Or if I'm with people who are Trump supporters, I may pose a question or something, but I'm not going to out and out oppose them. And that's me, even though I've studied groups and even though I talk about mindsets and mind shifting, groups have this unavoidable draw that kind of force us uh, to align with the other people in the group. And that really proves something. It's something fundamental. We're not weak if we let a group influence our thoughts or actions. It's because we're human. We're biologically wired to belong to groups. So why is that? Well, first of all, groups keeps us safe. Groups keep us safe. They give us identity. They help us make sense of the world. From an evolutionary standpoint, The antelope that gets isolated from the herd is the one that gets eaten by the lion, right? Because belonging is a survival mechanism, we have evolved in a way that rewards us for being parts of groups. And whenever we have social contact, our brains release a hormone called oxytocin. Oxytocin is a powerful hormone that increases feelings of love, belonging, and connection. It's the chemical that helps us bond with our families and build communities. So, you can imagine examples of that. Like imagine that you're sitting down for a holiday dinner. It's with your family, you're laughing with your closest friends. You have that warm, secure feeling of safety and camaraderie. That feeling you get is oxytocin that's flooding your system. It's rewarding you for finding and staying with your herd. And then also the way we've evolved, we've developed something in our brains called mirror neurons. And these mirror neurons drive us to imitate each other. Beyond the oxytocin that makes us want to stay, these mirror neurons naturally make us want to imitate the people who are around us. If you watch someone yawn, chances are you're going to want to yawn too. If you see people in your group desiring something, you're prompted to want the same thing. This biological drive to mirror each other, that helps us cooperate. It helps us work towards shared goals, but it can also incite rivalries and cause us to copy negative emotions like fear or anger. We don't consciously choose to conform, but our biology and our mirror neurons do that for us. So, for an example, one of the educators who were taking one of our mind shifting courses, they shared a really good example of this. She observed two first graders arguing over a spot in line for lunch. One kid pushed and yelled, "I was here first." Well, immediately the other child's mirror neurons fired, and they yelled and they pushed back, saying, "No, you cut." It's not that they logically decided to fight; it's that their biology forced them to imitate the aggression that they were seeing from their peer. And then a third point about our biology is centered in our pleasure and pain centers. Brain scans or functional MRIs have shown that when we feel ostracized or when we're criticized by a group, the pain centers and the emotional centers of the brain light up in the same way as when we're in physical pain or physical danger. Avoidance of pain means we are self censoring and changing our values and beliefs in order to conform to what we think the group wants. And I'm curious, if you have examples in your own lives, feel free to put them in the chat, and and we can talk about them also. So I'm going to change a little bit to self worth and the danger of belonging. Belonging feels good, but where it gets complicated is that our self worth becomes dangerously tied to our group membership. Because we as humans value our identity within a group, going against the group's expectations comes with a hidden emotional cost. Brain scans reveal that agreeing with a group activates our pleasure centers, whereas going against the group activates the pain centers in our anterior cingulate cortex and amygdala. In fact, our brains process social rejection and criticism using the exact same neural mechanisms as physical pain. We become highly compliant just to avoid the pain of being ostracized by our tribe. Here's a classic example from my book, Mind Shifting Conflict and Collaboration. Now, we talked earlier, just imagine you're at a family gathering. Well, this time, imagine that you're at Thanksgiving dinner and you take a bite of the turkey and you think, this is really dry. It's way overcooked. But then the hostess asks, "What do you think of the turkey?" And the person next to you says, "Oh, delicious." And everyone around the table nods, and then they all look at you. What do you do? Well, naturally, you'll say yummy or delicious. You'd never pipe up and say it tastes like firewood because going against the group feels too risky. And then you'll justify it by saying, "Oh, yeah, I said that because I didn't want to hurt her feelings." But That justification always comes after the decision was made. The decision is made quickly by your mirror neurons, and your limbic system, and then the justification comes afterwards. When we stay quiet to avoid pain, we fall victim to what researchers call collective illusions. These are social lies where a majority of individuals in a group privately reject an opinion, but they go along with it anyway because they incorrectly assume everyone else in the group accepts it. The result is everyone doing what nobody actually wants. And that's one of the dangers of the group. So maybe you can, again, put into the chat or something, think of a time where you went along with a group, even though something didn't feel right. Or perhaps sometime where you stayed quiet in a meeting when you disagreed. What made you stay quiet? Put your thoughts in the chat. And I'll say, we all do this. I do this. Let's say I'm in a group with a group of friends who are Jewish, and they start talking about how Israel needs to defend itself. Or maybe I'm in a group with friends of mine who are Muslims, and they start talking about the Jewish genocide in Palestine. Now, each group reinforces a stereotype about the other. And me, depending on which group I'm in, my strong inclination is not to go out on a limb in either case. Well, I mean, be I may test the waters with a question because, well, I, I'm me, but I'm not likely to go out on a limb and directly challenge the whole group. And therein lies what the group pressure does to all of us. Brute groups get us into a binary thinking and they get us into conflict. When the groups themselves are threatened, or when we feel our status in the group is threatened, we go into our fast, protective survival or limbic mode. And this forces us into binary thinking good, bad, yes, no, with no nuance. Group pressures push us to view complex situations as simple. It's us or it's them, or we're right, they're wrong. And these escalate conflicts rather than resolving them. Now, we see this happening with so many issues across society, right? Gun control or schools or issues within our families like views towards discipline or dating or homework. And groups often bond by enemifying outsiders, treating outsiders with hate. Hate and the pursuit of revenge can be unifying forces, giving a group a sense of exhilaration and mission by focusing on a common enemy. This locks us into a group conflict perpetuation loop, where our group norms create collective illusions, which lead to confirmation biases, which leads to enemifying outsiders and then fighting them, which reinforces the group norms, which reinforce the collective illusions, which lead to more confirmation bias, which leads to stronger enemifying the outsiders and fighting them, and on and on and on. So you might, an example of this was another educator in one of our courses shared an example of this happening in her high school. The athletic and popular students formed a cohesive group by heavily promoting negative ideas about the non athletic and music students, viewing them as weak, annoying, and weird. This allowed them to coalesce around their own group. The athletes bonded by enemifying the music kids, creating a rigid us versus them binary that led to constant negative interactions. It didn't matter who the individuals were. The group pressure really forced everyone to just to pick a side and see the other side as the enemy. So I'm wondering, have you ever been the only person in the room who saw things differently? And did you actually speak up? What happened when you challenged the binary thinking of the group, or were you able to challenge it? So, how do we immunize ourselves from this pressure? We have to break out of our limbic habits, and we can do this in four steps. We can recognize we're part of the problem. We have to admit that we conform also. We have to be able to access the resourceful parts of our mind, our sage mind. In other words, we have to learn how to quiet our limbic reactions, and It's really helpful if we participate in multiple diverse groups. Having multiple identities often shields our sense of self worth from being tied to just one tribe or group. And we have to trust others. Trust makes us more tolerant and nuanced. And to uh, to develop these four steps, recognizing we're part of the problem, accessing our stage mind, participating in multiple diverse groups, and trusting other groups, that's why we created the conversation circle guide. When the room changes your mind, how groups map, help, and hurt us. And that's the guide that has the QR code on here right now. Awareness is your first defense. By hosting a simple 45 to 60-minute guided discussion with your team or your family or friends, you can help people see how group pressure works and making it much harder for it to work on them, except when it's helpful to us as society or the family. So if you download this guide this week, there's really three things that I want you to practice noticing. Okay. First of all, as you're going about doing things this week, notice the go along. You catch yourself agreeing with the group this week, and then ask yourself, do I actually agree, or am I just going along? And then the second thing I want you to practice is what assumptions you're making. Notice when you assume that what everybody else is thinking, that everybody else is thinking the same thing. So ask yourself, am I making an assumption about what people think? And check it. And then the third thing that I want you to practice this, noticing this week is the person you want to help. When you see someone else conforming to group pressure, meet with them in empathy instead of frustration, because you know the biology that they're fighting against. Don't antagonize them and say, look, you're just going along with the group. Ask them open questions like, what's going through your mind? What are you thinking? Do you think that this might be group pressure instead of the judgmental or accusatory statements? And before I wrap this up, I do also want to announce one thing, and I'm just putting a different QR code um, up on the screen right now. Okay, is that I'd like to announce, and we're going to talk about this more next week when I have Josh Chernikoff as my guest, that on May 13th, I'm going to be giving a master class on the three biggest mistakes districts make when trying to improve student outcomes. And we're going to be also focusing on how, schools and districts can outlearn obstacles and improve those outcomes. So if you want to find out more or possibly register, and it's free, here's the QR code in order to sign up. So just to wrap up, I want to thank you for joining me on this LinkedIn Live and Substack Live today. I'd like you to maybe I'll see you in the master class on the three biggest mistakes districts make. And let me get the other QR code right here, back up here, and grab the when the room changes your mind conversation circle guide to discuss the roles that groups have on all of us and to expand everybody's awareness of the way groups work. And I hope that this has been valuable for you, and hope to see you next week for another Mind Shifting Monday with Mitch. Have a good week. Take care.